One of the recommendations I make to patients and to most people, which actually is a bit of it's an obvious one, but actually it tends to be something that really impacts on people's lives, is when you first wake up in the morning, have 2 glasses of water, then have a cup of tea or coffee. Because what it does is overnight, you're respiring, you're breathing out water vapor. You're warm in bed. It might be a warm night, but even if it's not, you're actually losing water out of the body naturally through respiration and just the metabolic processes. So, before you start to drink caffeine and coffee and tea in the morning, which again can take water out of the body and make you feel kind of really sluggish by mid-morning, which often you then compensate by drinking more caffeine, my recommendation, always start the day with at least a big glass of water, if not 2 glasses of water.
Welcome back to The Last Days of Rome. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Sandro Demaio, the CEO of VicHealth, a government agency aimed at improving the health outcomes for Victorians. With Dr. Demaio, we speak about death and how you can avoid it. It turns out there's some really promising evidence to suggest that by subscribing to this YouTube channel, you will live forever. It's not guaranteed, but it's looking pretty good. So give it a go and click subscribe. We also talk about VicHealth's work in the context of vaping and getting teens off of vaping or helping them avoid it entirely despite the best efforts of big tobacco. There's also some general health advice that I think a lot of people would find very useful. And overall, it's a great chat. I found this one to be really interesting, and I think you will too. So enjoy it.
Dr. Sandro Demaio, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
This is your first time here, you mentioned.
It is,
Not
yes.
bad, right?
This is the Mecca.
Yeah.
This is the kind of nerve center of Italian culture and information.
It is. I always find that people are surprised when they come here because in their heads they think it's like a small room with 4 people smoking, using Windows 95 or something.
4 nonnas.
Yeah, exactly right.
3 nonnas and
Yeah.
No, and it's funny, I grew up with Il Globo being such an important part of obviously my grandparents, my dad. To see where it all comes from, to pull back the proverbial curtain, It's very exciting.
Yeah, it's nice not to have you disappointed. We met a few weeks ago at an Alto event, probably a couple of months ago now, and I really enjoyed our chat then, and I've been looking forward to this a lot.
Thank you.
Something I have been really excited to ask you, can you please explain how Coke Zero has a 3.5-star health rating?
Oh gosh, you really jump in the deep end.
Going straight in.
So what you're talking about, health star rating, obviously is the label on the front of a lot of processed foods, packaged foods, and broader food items in the Australian market. It's about a 10-year-old system, and it's what we call an interpretive labeling system. So it's trying to make sense of that nutrition panel on the back, the ingredients list that you basically need a PhD to understand. Let's be honest, and 27 hours in the day. It's trying to make that as simple as possible. There are lots of different systems around the world. The one we have here, we kind of invented with New Zealand. And the way it works is that it actually compares, so first of all, the nutrients, so the amount of sugar, the amount of fat, the amount of salt in that product compared to other products in the same category.
Right.
And that's the clincher. That's the important part. Because you might have a food that's not very healthy, but healthier than all its brothers and sisters in that category. So think about like breakfast cereals. You could have 20 breakfast cereals that are packed with sugar. If one is slightly less packed with sugar, it could end up actually looking okay. Also, the other criticism is that you might end up with something that's 1 star. Well, many people would look at a food that's 1 star and say, hey, it's got 1 star. That means it's relatively, like there's some goodness to it. But actually 1 star is a complete failure.
Right.
So there are some flaws to the system. The reason that Coke Zero or zero sugar drinks tend to do okay in the system is because compared to their full sugar cousins, they're not as healthy. I personally don't drink drinks with artificial sweeteners because there is emerging evidence that they're associated with other diseases, including potentially an increased risk of chronic disease. But yeah, that's why. So the industry finds little loopholes. And unfortunately, while there's lots of strengths and it's better than nothing, the health star rating does have some limitations.
Right. So in short, it's a relative health star rating, a relative health rating.
That's right. To the other products in the category. So it's not, is this product healthy? Yes, no. It's, is this product healthier or less healthy on balance than all the other options if I want a sugary drink?
Yeah, that makes sense because I have a can of Campbell's vegetable soup with barley, and that's also 3.5 stars.
Yeah, okay.
And
so it becomes very confusing. You're like, wait, a Campbell's can of soup and a 0 sugar soft drink,
they're not the same.
Get the same number of stars.
Right.
Really confusing.
Yeah.
Well, that's why, because they're not comparing you're not comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing apples with its cousin apples and oranges with its cousin oranges.
And not even well by the sounds of things. So you would, if you had to pick between a Coke and a Coke Zero, you would pick the Coke.
Obviously.
Obviously. But if someone put a gun to your head and said you're being unhealthy for the day, you would choose the regular Coke?
No, look, I mean, both have risks. I don't know what I would pick, to be honest. I mean, so obviously normal soft drink, normal cola is really high in sugar, weight gain, diabetes, a whole bunch of risks. Also just makes you feel pretty crappy about an hour and a half after you drink it. It's got lots of caffeine as well. Whereas the fake sugars, I mean, it is an emerging area of science, but there is, credible evidence that they're a risk of chronic disease as well. So I'm going to have to dodge that question, but I'd probably try and have it neither if I could.
Cokes a day?
Yeah.
I mean, how bad is that? And in the morning, they would start at 10, 11 a.m.
Yeah, so, I mean, there is... colas are addictive in nature because they contain caffeine. Right. So just like coffee, if you wake up and you don't have a caffeinated beverage, you feel pretty rubbish. You can, it actually affects the blood flow in your brain, and what happens is that basically it makes you feel nauseated, gives you headaches, can affect your vision, gives you a dry mouth. Like it's not a very fun withdrawal kind of set of symptoms. So there's the caffeine in the beverage, but the other, of course, issue is we know, for example, like fake sugar drinks, generally people still consume as many calories even when they're eating fake sugar drinks. So it's not a very good way of trying to lose weight. You actually kind of trick your brain into thinking that it's had something sweet. It expects then an energy boost. It doesn't get it, and then it goes looking for energy elsewhere.
So it makes you hungrier.
So it can make you hungrier, and overall, people don't tend to lose weight drinking low sugar drinks because your body actually compensates. You're kind of trying to trick your body. Your body's smarter than that, unfortunately. Then there's the caffeine itself, and then there's what you're offsetting. So you're not drinking water, which in turn can make you feel pretty crappy because you become dehydrated, constipated, and everything else that comes with it. So yeah, I'd be conscious probably of drinking 5 or 6 cans of Diet Cola a day. I'd be trying to look for something, else that you could be drinking. Of course, then, in addition to all that, we haven't even talked about the impacts on your teeth. It's a very acidic product. It actually erodes the enamel on your teeth. So even though it doesn't have sugar, it can still increase the risk of tooth decay. Dentists are expensive, and quite frankly, I try to avoid the dentist any time I can.
Yeah, that's fair. Tea is also dehydrating. So on this though, when a drink is considered dehydrated, this just turned into like a private one.
Yeah, I know. You've got any moles you want me to check? Or?
Sorry. Okay, but it's not like...
Take a deep breath, cough twice.
Oh man, imagine if we filmed that. Okay, it's not as though you're consuming negative liquids, right? So let's say a cup of tea.
Yeah.
It's just that you're drinking slightly less liquid than you really are, if that makes sense.
No, so coffee and tea are both diuretics. So they actually take water out of your body through the kidneys. So they cause the kidneys to basically release more water. So if you think about it, imagine you've got like a dam.
Right.
This is the message to the kind of dam operator to open the floodgates, let some water out, in addition to the water you're putting in. So overall, if you drink like a cup of coffee, you're going to actually end up with less water in your body after drinking the coffee, even when you factor in the fact that you have drunk some liquid.
Wow.
Because it acts on the kidneys. The kidneys have to flush the chemicals that are in the coffee out. There are chemicals that also encourage the kidneys to release more liquid. So tea, yes. Coffee also. If you're drinking a really long, like iced tea that's really weak, probably the on balance is you end up with slightly more water in the body than you pee out. But you'll find that if you drink a coffee, even if it's a short coffee in the morning, you might end up then peeing not long afterwards. The pee will be very dark, and you're actually taking then more water out of your body than you put in the first place. So they're what's called diuretics.
I feel like that's common. Is that like a common thing that everyone knows and I'm an idiot? Or is
No,
that,
absolutely not. I mean, one of the recommendations I make to patients and to most people, which actually is it's an obvious one, but actually it tends to be something that really impacts on people's lives, is when you first wake up in the morning, have 2 glasses of water, then have a cup of tea or coffee. Because what it does is overnight you're respiring, you're breathing out water vapor. You're warm in bed. It might be a warm night, but even if it's not, you're actually losing water out of the body naturally through respiration and just the metabolic processes. So before you start to drink caffeine and coffee and tea in the morning, which again can take water out of the body and make you feel kind of really sluggish by mid-morning, which often you then compensate by drinking more caffeine, my recommendation, always start the day with at least a big glass of water, if not 2 glasses of water. And that will be pulled in to the bowel, help you kind of do your morning poop. It will also help to balance out, the amount of coffee you're about to drink, and it will just give you the best kind of boost to start the day.
Yeah, nice. Let's move on to what you're really here to talk about, which is vaping.
Well, you mean I'm not here to talk about Diet Cola and poop?
Yeah, you're not here to talk about my poop schedule. Which is always 2, by the way. Is that a thing? Is that normal?
2 poops.
I always have to do a follow-up poop.
Interesting. What, in the morning, or do you do that later in the day?
I would say, yeah, so I would say the first ones, we totally have to edit this, but I would say 8 a.m., first one.
That's very normal.
And then another at 11.
Oh, mid-morning poop.
Yeah, and I call that my finish-up job. I don't know why.
Interesting. Okay, no, look, it's not abnormal.
Should I be worried?
No, you shouldn't be worried. If it's, particularly if it's something that's kind of a regular thing, you shouldn't be worried at all. I mean, it might be that you have a really good high-fiber diet, and so there's more bulk that you're pooping out. Most people, healthy people, will poop at least once a day, most often in the morning, most often after you've had coffee and you've been awake for, say, half an hour or so. But not unusual to have a second poop, across the day at some point.
I had absolutely no intention of bringing that up, I have to tell you.
No, it's all right. We've talked about, urine, poop.
Nice.
We're covering all the bases.
I know, straight away. Okay. In your role as CEO of VicHealth,
Yeah.
at the moment, there's an initiative about preventing teens from vaping. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing in this field?
Yeah, so we've seen this really worrying trend over the last couple of years, a huge increase out of almost nowhere of young people taking up e-cigarettes. These are, coming in bright colours, unicorns on the packet. They look like highlighters or makeup pens. They come in flavours like Fruit Loops and milk, and they're highly addictive. These products are generally coming across our borders from overseas, many of them out of China. They're very cheaply made. They contain lithium batteries that break down or even blow up because they're incredibly cheaply built. And they contain more than 200 toxic chemicals, including chemicals found in rat poison, nail polish remover, used in the embalmment of dead bodies, like very, very toxic chemicals.
Formaldehyde?
Formaldehyde, exactly.
Aside, I used to work at a funeral home, and I know that smell.
Yes,
so
and
well.
it's not something you want to be breathing deep into your lungs, no. So the worry is that we have spent 70 years kind of cleaning up the mess that was created by cigarettes. And you have to remember, we weren't around really at the peak of cigarettes. You and I might have been around at the tail end, but we certainly weren't adults. And there was about 20 years between the peak of cigarette smoking and the peak of cancer, and then about 50 years before we really started to take strong action. And now, after, as I say, 70 years since the first really credible warnings on the fact that smoking causes cancer, it's taken 70 years to get the smoking rates back down to really low numbers in Australia, and we've still got work to do. So I suppose in the face of seeing, potentially a whole new generation of Australians becoming addicted to nicotine, the big tobacco, the tobacco industry rearing its head once again with a new product that smells and looks remarkably like cigarettes, and contains, as much nicotine in a single e-cigarette as 6 packets of cigarettes.
Really?
And we know that young people who take up e-cigarettes are 3 times more likely to go on to smoke traditional cigarettes. So putting all of that together, it's alarm bells ringing for government and for public health agencies and for doctors like myself. And so we're very focused on making sure that we learn from the past, that we don't repeat it, and that we act much more urgently and early in protecting young people, that we don't take 70 years to get this problem under control. We get on top of it early, that we call the industry out, we call big tobacco out for what they're doing, going after our kids once again, and that we put the proper protections in place for young people.
When you say big tobacco, is that hyperbole to get a message across, or is it literally the same companies?
No, it's literally the same companies.
Wow, yeah.
So you look at Philip Morris International, you look at British American Tobacco. They openly say on their websites that they have invested in e-cigarettes. They've got major shareholdings in many of the e-cigarette companies. There are smaller independent companies that are not linked to tobacco, but then a lot of the lobbying that's being done, a lot of the science that's being funded to try and pretend that these products are safer than they are or more helpful than they are, is being funded by the tobacco industry. So yeah, I mean, I use big tobacco. It's a bit of a, I suppose, cheeky framing in a way. But what I'm talking about is, of course, the 4 or 5 biggest tobacco companies that, for 70 years have been selling the only known product in history that, if used exactly as they recommend to their consumers, will kill 1 in 2 long-term users.
Correct me if I'm wrong. This is my understanding of the current legal status. It's any sort of e-vape, e-cigarette is completely illegal in Australia. Is that correct? Unless you get a prescription.
So about 3 years ago, so I should take a step back. So every country in the world is struggling with this at the moment, with e-cigarettes, the rise of e-cigarettes. The industry used COVID, young people being isolated online, high levels of anxiety, and governments distracted with, a virus that was very dangerous, is very dangerous. They used that situation to really push these products hard through social media onto young people, and it was very successful. Right. Very high rates of e-cigarette use among young people around the world in a very short period of time. Huge problem. All countries are trying to tackle that, and while some countries have banned them outright, other countries have taken different paths, and Australia took a path about 3 years ago of saying, okay, there are 2 distinct populations that we need to think about. The first is your 65-year-old truckie who's been smoking for 45 years, tried everything else, tried the patches, tried the gums, called the quit line 10 times, and they think that they can get some help from using e-cigarettes. The evidence is actually very poor, but let's put that aside. They think that they can get some help by using e-cigarettes. We want to give them access to an e-cigarette, but we want that e-cigarette to be safe. We want to make sure that it has checks and balances, that it doesn't blow up in their face. And it certainly doesn't need to come flavoured like Fruit Loops and milk with a unicorn on the packet for a 65-year-old truckie. But that truckie also needs to see their GP, because they might have early signs of cancer, they might have heart disease, they might have other forms of chronic disease. So what the government said was, yes, you can get access to an e-cigarette if you've tried everything else, no flavours, no colours, or through a pharmacy with a prescription from your doctor. But the young people who have never smoked, have no interest in smoking, but are now being hooked on e-cigarettes, we need to do everything to protect them. So they put this plan in place, which was the first in the world at the time, a prescription model, very similar to how we would think about antibiotics or the oral contraceptive pill. So it's not banned, you just need a prescription to be able to access them. Some challenges, though, started to emerge. So the industry found some loopholes, the main one of which was that they only banned at the time e-cigarettes that contain nicotine. So if an e-cigarette simply didn't write that it contained nicotine on the packet, they could sell it anywhere they wanted, because they found a loophole in the system. And that's what happened. And so you would have seen across the road from pretty much every primary school in the country, you've got these kind of flavor, you've got these kind of lolly stores selling e-cigarettes that actually do contain very high levels of addictive nicotine, but just simply don't put it on the packet, and therefore they get around the laws. What the government's now doing, which will actually go to federal parliament next month, is closing that loophole and saying that any e-cigarette outside the prescription pathway will be illegal, but we're going to make it easier for people who have a legitimate need. The 65-year-old truckie, will make it easier for them to access it through a GP by making it open to any GP to be able to prescribe and to nurse practitioners.
So at the moment though, as of today, a kid can go and buy one of these weird unicorn Fruit Loop flavored e-cigarettes that have no nicotine.
Correct.
Okay. Let's go to the truckie for a moment. You said that the average e-cigarette has the same amount of nicotine as 6 packs of cigarettes.
Yes, can do, yeah.
Can do, all right. Let's say that this truck driver...
There are e-cigarettes on the market that are about $30 and they have 8,000 puffs. And what we're seeing is that these are actually probably more addictive than traditional cigarettes.
What about harm? So let's say, just to make this very simple, this truck driver is vaping 1 pack a day, equivalent.
Yep.
Would you say that the health effects of this even out, or is what he's doing slightly better than had he been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day? Where is he health-wise?
Yeah, it's a good question, and honestly, we don't actually know, because you have to remember that there was 20 years between the peak of smoking and the peak of cancer, the last time we had, this problem. Industry at the time said, no, cigarettes are safe. They paid doctors and pilots and supermodels to sell cigarettes, and they hid all the evidence that they were actually carcinogenic. Turns out, actually, they cause cancer, and they've killed, hundreds of thousands of Australians since. The evidence where it stands at the moment is that, on balance, the 65-year-old truckie is safer using an e-cigarette than a cigarette, and that's why a doctor, on balance, with a prescription, would give them an e-cigarette rather than have them continue to smoke cigarettes. I think that on balance will continue to be the case, but e-cigarettes over time we're starting to realise that even e-cigarettes do have risks. So there's early signs of changes in animal studies around that suggest that e-cigarettes may be associated with other chronic diseases. We just haven't seen. They haven't been around long enough to kind of see it yet. But yeah, on balance, if I had a truckie who has tried everything else, tried patches, tried gums, and on the balance, felt that e-cigarettes were going to help them to get off cigarettes, the pathway with a prescription is exactly set up for them to reduce their risk by getting them onto an e-cigarette, and then eventually getting them off e-cigarettes onto gums, patches, or even off nicotine altogether.
But you're skeptical that would actually happen. You're saying that there's no evidence that it will actually help them get off nicotine.
The evidence of e-cigarettes for tobacco cessation broadly it's still sketchy, to be honest. So there are really well-respected scientists who say that they're helpful. There are really well-respected scientists who say actually the evidence is not that clear. But the situation in Australia at the moment is if you go to your GP and you've been smoking for many years and you've tried everything else, so it's a last line therapy, because we know that gums, for example, work, and we know that they're safe. We know that patches work, and we know that they're safe. We know the quit line's there, and we know that it's safe. So you'd use everything else first, but if none of those work, then e-cigarettes, if they're produced correctly, with no flavours and no colours, and sold through a pharmacy where we know, what's in them and who's made them, and they're of a certain quality, that's the pathway that's been created and endorsed by the Australian government.
One of the symptoms, I don't know if you'd call it this, or one of the health effects that come as a result of vaping that I keep coming across in research is popcorn lung. Yeah. What is that?
Yeah, so there are a number of different conditions, and there was another one called Avali, which is basically like an inflammatory. So you have to understand that when you're breathing the plume cloud in, what you're breathing in is this kind of mixture of very thick. So it's a liquid that's been, if in the canister, it's this very thick, viscous liquid. It's kind of sticky. You get on your fingers, it's hard to get off. It vaporizes that and then delivers it into your lungs. As soon as it hits your lungs, it goes back to being that incredibly thick, sticky bunch of chemicals. But now it's coating all of the little tiny alveoli or all the little tiny air sacs in your lungs that you use to transfer air from oxygen from the air into your bloodstream and carbon dioxide from your bloodstream back into the air. So popcorn lung is a condition. It's one of a few conditions that basically you get inflammation in the lung resulting from this bunch of chemicals. So the chemicals come in, your immune system thinks, gosh, there's an absolute mess. What are you breathing in? There's all this crap that you're breathing in. We need to clean it up. The body then basically starts to attack its own tissue and causes damage to the lung tissue and causes these. I mean, it's not dissimilar from some of the diseases that we see in long-term smokers.
Right.
It hasn't been clear. Some of the, for example, Avali, which is an inflammatory kind of condition, was associated with certain additives that were put into the e-cigarettes, because these e-cigarettes are hundreds of chemicals mixed together. They're not necessarily always the same chemicals, and there were certain types of chemicals that were particularly toxic to the lungs, some of which have been taken out, but many of which are still in there.
And they're fatal, right? Popcorn lung can be fatal.
It can be, absolutely, yeah. And so there have been a number of cases of people dying in the US with a much larger population, but yeah, there have been cases of people dying of Avali in the US of a kind of acute lung injury. There's also been a significant increase in overdose and child deaths here in Australia with toddlers drinking the liquid that you put in these products. You've also got hospitalizations of kids with the products kind of blowing up in their hands or their faces. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different ways that they can be very acutely damaging, and then there's all the long-term health consequences that we're worried about as well.
Right. Presumably secondhand smoke would be just as bad with e-cigarettes, right?
Yeah, so again, we
don't
know because it took us a long time to prove the dangers of cigarettes,
Right.
And not to mention the fact that the tobacco industry tried to cover it up the whole time. But yes, I mean, you would imagine, what we do know is that if you smoke, if you exhale these products, particularly in a closed environment, like think about a car, you exhale these products, we know that the vapor does linger in the air. Others can then breathe it in. We know that it then also settles on surfaces, and so kids can be touching the surfaces, ingesting, the chemicals.
Right.
It's in lower quantities, obviously, than if a kid picks up the liquid and drinks it, which can be fatal, very easily fatal in that circumstance. And we've seen cases of kids dying in Australia from that. But we don't know the long-term consequences, and we probably won't for many years. But I think in that circumstance, we need to take, a kind of precautionary approach. Everyone talks about harm reduction. Well, it's like, okay, but breathing air is much safer than breathing these products. So for the vast majority of people who are being hooked on these things, i.e. kids, the reduced harm opportunity is to have them continue to breathe air, not put them on e-cigarettes when they actually have no interest in cigarettes anyway.
Right. Is a part of what you're doing now kind of an uphill battle, because the demographic that you're trying to protect, teenagers, they're always going to be sort of attracted to risky and rebellious behavior. Not to say that therefore we should do nothing about vaping, but I guess, do you find it to be an uphill battle?
It's funny, I mean, so if you ask the average 12-year-old, do you like smoking, or do you like the smell of smoke, or do you like to be around smokers? I mean, I remember when I was probably like 18, and I was going to nightclubs for the first time, and the place would be filled with smoke.
Right.
and after about 3 hours, your throat would burn, your eyes would burn, you'd go home just stinking, your clothes would stink, you'd have to have a shower, you'd have a kind of husky throat for half the next day, and you felt like absolute crap. We would never allow that to happen. Young people today would just walk straight out.
Yeah, they're repulsed by it.
Yeah, they're repulsed by it. And so, how do we get to that point for, sure, they might find something else, and they might find, another way to be risky. But, I mean, this is not kids waking up bored and thinking, oh, how can I rebel against my parents? This is an industry that has, used exactly the same tactics that they used 50 years ago, in a really predatory and organised way, in a way that undermines parents and teachers and, leaders in society. It's been an organised sort of effort by industry. So if kids were, and we know that also because when we talk to kids, they actually don't know the harms associated with e-cigarettes.
Right.
They've been seeing messages that are often delivered by the tobacco industry on their social media that these things are safe. They're having them promoted to them through social media. They're having them, on TikTok, click here and it's delivered out the back of a Camry opposite a primary school, 3 hours later or whatever. I don't believe that kids, there's no evidence, and in fact we've got evidence that is the opposite, that kids have kind of suddenly all woken up interested in e-cigarettes. It's more that the industry
has pushed it on them.
Has really pushed it on them, and they're extremely addictive.
I remember when I used to do stand-up, so many of the comics started vaping weed because they thought that was a much healthier option. You've spoken before about your thoughts on, or you claimed in a lecture that you don't have a position on the legalization of cannabis, but
No.
do you have...
You do your homework.
Well, I try. Do you have a position, though, on the health effects of cannabis use?
Not really, and it's not. And I'm really not trying to dodge the question. It's more just that it's not a space that VicHealth is in.
Okay.
And so I don't particularly have a position. I think it's more of a question probably, for the AMA really.
Right. Fair enough. Okay, let's come back to vaping for a moment. If we take the logic that a product is harmful to young people and therefore the government should prevent young people having access to that product, wouldn't it also be the case then that we should ban fast food? I mean, logically, forget the political viability for a moment because we know that would be incredibly difficult, almost impossible. But using the same logic, ideally we would also ban fast food outlets, right?
Well, what governments are always trying to do is look at the, balancing risks. And, if you compare fast food to vaping, there's the kind of the strength of the risk and then the strength of the certainty around the risk. So, we know that e-cigarettes are highly addictive. We know that they contain chemicals that are carcinogenic. We know that they are delivered deep into the lungs, and that there's really, emerging evidence that there's no safe level of e-cigarette use. At the same time, you don't need an e-cigarette to survive. Kids don't need to kind of, it's not something that's sort of required.
Right.
You could argue that, junk food also similarly. So
targeted towards children as
Yes,
well. They've
yep.
got playgrounds, Happy Meals have toys in them.
Yep.
So I'm seeing a lot of similarities.
Yeah. Do you think we should ban junk food?
In an ideal world, yeah. I do.
I think we could do. Yeah, I think we could do a lot more on junk food. I think the strength of the risk posed in terms of, the lethality of, so how kind of lethal is junk food versus e-cigarettes. It's a bit of a hard comparison to make. But I think on junk food, if we were to ban advertising to kids, limit, the density of junk food around primary schools, not allow them to sell kind of meals that are specifically tailored to kids with toys. There's lots that we could do to reduce, I think, the kind of addictive and predatory nature of junk food. And much of that we are also working on, which we strongly advocate for. I mean, I would love to see, us think about all of those things. The pricing of sugary drinks. Many countries have, an increased price on sugary drinks. They use that money to then subsidise cheaper food for families that are struggling to afford good food. We could do that in Australia.
Right.
Banning advertising to children. I mean, why?
Haven't we done that? Aren't fast food outlets not allowed to advertise during children's shows?
Yeah, so we've kind of taken a half step, and it was a good half step, don't get me wrong, but there are countries that ban outright, including in the digital space, advertising of junk food to kids, period. And there are a lot of loopholes in the rules we have in Australia, which, again, it was a step forward. I'm not criticising it, but there's still a lot more we could do. So, I think we have to look at all of the challenges that kids face. I mean, e-cigarettes have come out of nowhere. They're highly addictive. I think addictive in a different way to junk food, but I take your point about the addictive nature of junk food, and the emerging evidence around its risks in terms of
carcinogenic. Right?
are extremely concerning. But we have a lot of work to do in this country, including on protecting kids from junk food. And I suppose also the flip side of that is that we've seen a doubling of food insecurity over the last couple of years. So many families struggling to afford good food. You and I as Italians, I was incredibly lucky to grow up in a family where food is so inherent in our culture. It's a very celebrated part of our lives. And, my nonna had a big vegetable garden. How do we make sure that that's not just for rich families in rich neighbourhoods, but, how do we celebrate our food culture as the most multicultural state in the country and one of the most multicultural countries in the world? There's also a really positive opportunity to celebrate our food cultures, our food history. We don't need junk food. We don't need fast food, because we have incredible food cultures that we can be celebrating and supporting. But that also takes, collective willpower and ultimately also some support from government.
Yeah, absolutely. My grandparents almost never ate out. That's another thing.
I mean, 2 generations ago, even I remember growing up, we were lucky to eat out probably once a month when I was young.
My grandmother didn't understand why we would go to restaurants.
Well, I'm going to guess that, if anyone ever tried your grandmother's cooking, they also probably wouldn't understand why you'd ever go to a restaurant.
It is good. I'm sure that's all of us.
I would take my nonna's dinner over a meal out any day.
Yeah, for sure. She's getting older, and one of the saddest things, apart from mortality, of course, is I don't actually get to have that anymore because she's not cooking as much.
Yeah.
And you realize how much of her cooking was a way to connect with us and show her love, because she wasn't the warmest person, to be honest, my nonna.
Yeah.
But through food, she showed us that she loved us, basically.
Yeah. We were exactly the same. She was pretty tough at times, and nonna had already died by the time I was young, so she always wore black, and she was fairly, she's pretty strict, but she always, showed us love with food. And I have to say, I end up doing the same now. Food is definitely one of my love languages. But are you collecting the recipes from your nonna? Have you written them down? And
I've thought about it.
You need to get her on the podcast.
I know, I should. I'm just not a cook. I'm such a lazy person.
But write them down so that your kids or your,
that's a good idea.
Maybe one day you'll have an epiphany and decide to go back and, fall in love with food again or cooking.
I hope so.
And then you'll have them written somewhere.
Yeah.
Don't lose them.
Honestly, I'm letting myself go, and I need to start cooking more because I definitely eat way too much junk. So that would be great to have such an epiphany. I want to ask you something that you've spoken about publicly. So otherwise I probably wouldn't bring it up, but you have talked about this, that as a result, I would assume mostly of your stance against vaping, you've received death threats.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that? I guess my first question is, just to sort of understand the nature of them, in what form do they come? Are they just sort of random social media accounts that send you a private DM? Are they letters? Like, how do they?
Yeah, so, I mean, I won't go into it
Sure.
too much, but we have had. I mean, we have had. I have had fairly aggressive responses from industry. Look, I understand that there are people who make money from these products, and even people who have invested money in a bricks and mortar shop. I'm not trying to put anyone out of business. That's I don't wake up in the morning and think, oh, how can I try and make life hard for the shop down the road or whatever. But I'm also conscious that these products have actually been banned for a long time. Many stores, not all, but many have been trading these products illegally, really using loopholes and selling these products to kids. And there are lots of articles that show, countless kind of media exposés that show these stores are openly selling them to kids in school uniforms. So I have gone fairly hard on e-cigarettes, and I think also because there's an urgency. Like, we're talking about a product that is highly addictive, that increases the risks of kids then going on to smoke threefold, for which we don't know the long-term consequences. Like, we're literally doing an experiment on an entire generation of Australians, and the last time we did this, it ended up in a world of pain that took us decades to clean up, and resulted in lots of people losing lives, uncles, aunties, parents, kids, grandparents. So, I have been fairly aggressive in my response to e-cigarettes, and particularly the tobacco industry, and they've been aggressive in return. And at times that's meant that we've had to involve, the authorities or take certain measures. It's not, I don't for a second condone it. I don't think that it's necessary. I think we do need to be able to have evidence-based debate about, what different people might have different opinions about the policy responses required, even if we all agree, and hopefully we do, that kids need to be protected from these products. But yeah, it's got uncomfortable at certain points for sure.
I honestly can't think, maybe aside from Anthony Fauci, I can't think of a better person to ask this next question. What are your views on the way the internet has changed culture surrounding medical health experts? I mean, it's almost a significant portion of the population now is just inherently and reactionary, opposed to anything a public health expert says. I imagine you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, right?
Yeah. Look, it's funny, when you look at the trust survey, so even the 2023, the most recent trust survey in Australia, medical professionals and doctors are still, if not the kind of, in the top 2 or 3 most trusted professions in society. So people overall, even though for all that we read in the media and all of the rhetoric and hate and vitriol that you see on what was Twitter, actually Australians still trust doctors and the medical community, which I think is not a reason for us to pat ourselves on the back. It's a reminder of the incredible responsibility we have to always be doing our homework, speaking truth, and also have the best interests of Australians at heart when we're talking, and be free of conflicts of interest. But there's definitely, what we've seen on Twitter over the last 12 months, it going from a fairly open, progressive platform for debate and conversation to, it just being kind of a cesspool. The ability for people to be able to say the most vicious and disgusting things that they would never say in real life. And I think even more concerningly, the fact that I feel as though sometimes it gives an authority or gives them the confidence then to say it in real life, that we're starting to see, hate speech and racism kind of in areas that I don't think, are completely unacceptable, never acceptable, and totally disgusting. But I think almost the digital environment, because people can get away with it in the digital space, I worry that there's even a feeling now that, maybe you can get away with it in the physical space as well. So I think it has, on one hand, it's democratized, there's lots of benefits. It's democratized information. There are so many great doctors and kind of health influencers online that are truly spreading really good information, that are making difficult day-to-day decisions and really tricky health information simple. But there's also a lot of crap out there, and there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of people trying to take advantage of people, a lot of fear-mongering.
Sure. I mean, let's say the biggest podcast on the planet, the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just rife with misinformation.
Yeah. I've never listened to it.
You've never listened to it?
No.
Really?
No, I've never listened to it.
I don't know if
I
believe that.
No,
Really?
I know of him.
Interesting.
But I've never listened to it.
I'd
Yeah.
love to get your thoughts. You should
Okay.
listen to some
Maybe
episodes.
we should listen to it together.
Yeah,
sometime.
sure. I mean, I'd love you to do a reaction video to that because honestly, it's quite incredible. Anyway, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but it's almost, what I've noticed is some people have gotten to the point, I won't say brainwashed, but they've gotten themselves to an ideological position where they will view any sincere attempt from the state to improve people's lives as dystopian.
Yeah.
So the fact that somebody like you has ideas about what would improve people's health, already they just don't like that because it's almost a sort of, like I said before, a reactionary aversion to government in a way.
And look, we've always had an element of that, and also we have to remember that there are very strong vested interests who, particularly in a progressive government environment, the last thing that the tobacco industry wants is us having a meaningful, mature conversation about how we protect kids from e-cigarettes, and then looking at the evidence and making a decision as a country, based on the evidence and based on a mature conversation, what we think we should do next. Because I can tell you it won't be what they think we should do. So there are lots of vested interests who are stoking the fuel, to try and create more misinformation, more dissent, more hatred, more division, more polarization. I think we just have to continue to do what we can to counter that. I think platforms like yours and the Global more broadly, such a huge responsibility, I think, on journalists, as there always has been, to give balanced but really evidence-based viewpoints to help people understand the world, to make sense of misinformation, to be a trusted platform and voice. And I think there's the same responsibility on leaders and on doctors like myself. But yeah, it is. Look, it's challenging, and I think it's becoming more challenging.
I'm really conscious of your time. I have two more quick questions, and we should be able to wrap this up on time.
Perfect.
Okay, I read one of your blog articles where you were making the case for making lifestyle changes because it increases longevity, of course, but also even if it doesn't, it at least improves quality of life. And people would then, on average, die in different ways to what they are now. So you're less likely to die of non-communicable diseases and so on. Is there a good way to die?
Oh, that reminds me of that awesome video from about 10 years ago, the cartoon Dumb Ways to Die. Have you seen that?
You should
Google that later. That was a
will.
really clever public health campaign done by
It's ringing a bell.
Trains back in the day, which I don't think they even exist now. And it went viral. It was very clever. Anyway, good ways to die. Look, I think everyone has to die at some point, and I think my aim is to try and help people to be as healthy for as long as possible. My grandma, she was 101. She actually died not long ago, about two months ago.
I'm sorry to hear.
Thank you. Look, Betty was an amazing, amazing individual, and she died in what I think is the way that anyone would be lucky to go, and more people would be lucky to go. She basically got to 100. She decided she was ready. She was able to die in dignity at home with her family, and she was healthy, independent, and relatively active right until the end. The challenge we have is that that's not how most people die in Australia. The average Australian lives with 13 years of pain and suffering at the end of their life from diseases that we know how to prevent. We're just simply not putting the things in place to support people to avoid those diseases. So particularly diseases like diabetes, cancer, heart disease, there are things that we've talked about today that would make a huge difference to tens of thousands of people in those final years.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's about giving people back, I suppose, those last 10 years. How can we make sure that every Australian is as healthy for as long as possible, and then at some point has to go on to whatever comes next, but doesn't have years of pain and suffering prior.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, one last question. I mean, anyone could speculate on this, but it makes sense to ask someone like you. If you could project...
You have a great way of setting up questions.
Do I?
Yeah. It puts a lot of pressure, but it also makes me kind of like lean in thinking, my gosh, what is he about to ask me?
That's funny.
The Fauci reference before.
Right.
I mean, I was like, man, that is pressure. Comparing me to
sorry.
Fauci, he's a wonderful man. I take it as a big compliment.
You should. You know why I also do it? Because sometimes I feel that my questions are stupid.
Oh, no.
And so I have to... Maybe,
no such thing as a stupid question.
Well, I don't know. I feel like I have to use sophistry to convince you in the audience they're not dumb questions.
No. They've been good questions.
If you can project yourself, let's say 500, 1,000 years into the future, do you think we'll ever be able to prevent death and become immortal? Like, will science ever get to that point?
I don't think so. Well, at the moment, our life expectancy is going backwards.
Yeah, I heard you say
for the
that.
first time in the history of mankind, in fact, or personkind, we're now living shorter life expectancies, or our kids are likely to. And that's, again, from the same diseases we're talking about. No, I think based on what I know about the human body and the fact that sort of aging is built in, and then the psychology of the fact that humans, even if I think we gave them the option to live forever, but they had to live a really boring life, I just can't see it happening. I don't think cryogenics will ever get there either, but maybe Are
there sincere attempts at that?
There are. Well, they kind of come and go, don't they, when billionaires suddenly get to the end of their lives,
right.
In waves every kind of 10 years. Yeah, so I don't know, would you want to live forever?
I'd like the option.
Yeah?
I have
Imagine though if everyone lived forever.
know.
Imagine how crowded it would be.
Well, we would have to stop having kids. If we got to that point, we would have to stop having kids.
So then there'd just be eventually, there'd just be a huge bunch of old people.
But presumably, if we've fixed the death problem, we've also been able to rejuvenate cells and stuff, right? So we could be in our peak.
So everyone, so it's just going to be like an entire planet of beautiful...
Yeah, we're all hot.
Or beautiful people in their 20s.
100%. That's what I'm hoping for.
Well...
Don't kill my dream.
I look forward to joining your utopian kingdom one day.
Fair enough. Dr. Sandro Demaio, I really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Did you enjoy that? Well, then why not consider subscribing and supporting this channel? We need all the help we can get. My producer, the guy filming right now, he lives in his car. And quite frankly, he's starting to smell. It's tough. It's tough to be around him. But the more of you that subscribe and view, we can get him a place to rent. Doesn't have to be a nice place, okay? He's living in his own filth right now. We don't expect a palace, but just get him a home. Something with a bathroom, for the love of God. Please, subscribe.